Hello everyone, and welcome to what I think is going to be a really interesting conversation this evening. Thank you all for joining us. It's amazing to see such interest in this topic. Just as a bit of context for people who might not be as familiar, the Romany Gypsy community first came to Blackpool in the 19th century, and they set up camp on the cliffs at North Shore, and they later moved to South Shore, where their camp became known as Gypsyville. And they've played an extremely important role in Blackpool's entertainment and seaside history, and we'll be looking at those things in more detail this evening. We will also be sharing some images from the collection here tonight, and I really hope you enjoy it. So without further ado, I'm really thrilled to introduce Sharon Heppell, who has kindly agreed to chat with me this evening. Sharon, I don't want to talk for you, so would you like to tell people a little bit about yourself before we get started?
Yeah, hello everybody, pleased to see you all. I was a writer and a family historian for very many years, and I live now in London, although I was born in Kent, but I do have very strong roots in Blackpool. So here I am now. I'm retired now, but still fascinated by the Blackpool Gypsy community.
Thank you, Sharon. And you made an incredible discovery when doing your own research, the kind of discovery that many researchers only dream of, something that was life-changing for you. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, when I was growing up, there was never any talk in our family about us having any gypsy roots. And so when I began to research my family tree in the early 80s, and by then my father's father, my grandfather, had passed away, and he was the one that I discovered had the gypsy ancestors. It was a complete, surprise and a great pleasure to discover, as I worked down through his lineage, to find out that he had gypsy ancestors, and in fact it was his mother who was the gypsy who was on the beach at Blackpool and telling fortunes. My granddad was a very reserved man, so he didn't really talk much about his family. And he was born in a house at South Shore. But I discovered, as I was beginning to go down the family tree, that his mother had been born in Norfolk. Her name was Pamela, which perhaps is not so unusual a name. But then I discovered that her mother was a lady called Lemontaine Smith, and her father, according to her marriage certificate, was a horse dealer. Now, and I was thinking, well, how are they going to get from North Wythe in Blackpool if they're Norfolk people? And I began to run into a brick wall because their surname was Smith, and I couldn't really find them very easily in records. And it was then that I was introduced to somebody called David Smith, and not a gypsy himself, but one of the country's experts in British Romany Gypsy history. And it was he that said, "I know all about your family." And he pointed me to a book that had been published in 1910. And there was my family tree laid out for me with all my relatives on it. So that was how it all started. Before we go on any further, I'd just like to say, in the course of doing my research, I discovered obviously about the history of gypsies generally in the British Isles, and perhaps not everybody knows that they actually arrived in this country about 500 years ago. So the first documented sighting of them was actually in Scotland in about 1505. So we're talking now about the reign of Henry VIII. And so they've been part of British society for 5 centuries. And to find their earlier roots, you have to go all the way back to northwest India, because that's where a nomadic tribe in about the year 1000 began to migrate towards the west. They don't know why they decided to leave their homeland, but that's where the roots of the British Romany Gypsies are. All those that millennium ago, and all those thousands of miles away.
And were you able to find out a bit more about your relations? You know, what were they like as people? Where had they been prior to coming to Blackpool? Did you uncover any details like that?
Yes, I mean, as I looking at a few notes I've got here. So, yeah, as I say, I ran into a bit of a brick wall, but then got the help from David Smith. And in the early 90s, I was thinking about doing a course at London University in genealogy. And we had the opportunity to pick a topic for doing a diploma, and any topic of our choice. And I thought, well, I'll go back to these Smiths and see what I can find out about them. And in the course of that, not only was it, a huge pleasure to find that they were Romany Gypsies, but they were also part of something of a phenomenon which I don't think has ever been seen before or since in British history. In that, talking now about the 1860s, one relative, one of my Smith relatives, and his family came up with the bright idea of actually opening up their encampments to the general public and charging them a small fee to come in and see how real gypsies lived. So they would open up their tents and open up their caravans and let people come and visit them. Not only that, but they decided they were going to travel the country, and in each town or city where they stopped, they put on a big advertising campaign to let people know that they were on their way. And they also arranged to hold dances, social dancing, sometimes within their own camp, but sometimes they would rent a public space like an assembly room or a corn exchange. They would hire an orchestra to come and play the music. They would hire caterers, and they would charge people to come in and dance with each other. I mean, I think a lot of people came along thinking that they were going to be able to dance with the gypsy girls, which was a no-no. But and to meet the self-styled king and queen of the gypsies, so that they would have these fabulous costumes that they would wear. And so my family was part of that group. They were called the Epping Forest Gypsies. So if you see old photographs of Blackpool with the advertising hoardings on the South Shore, they often say from Epping Forest, although they in fact came from lots of places in Essex and Suffolk and Norfolk.
And you mentioned this idea of sort of opening up the gypsy camps for people. People were so fascinated by the gypsy way of life, weren't they, Sharon? And it was sort of quite a status thing to go and get your fortune told, and quite fashionable to immerse yourself in the gypsy way of life. And in Blackpool, I believe there was actually a train track built around Gypsyville, as it was called, and people would alight at that station and kind of just walk around and be a part of that community. And you might think that sounds weird. We wouldn't endorse that today. You'd be told off for being, rightly so, very nosy. But you've got things like reality television today. So I think that's just human nature, isn't it? Just to be curious and want to know about other lives.
I think the Romany people they've always been viewed with a certain amount of fascination by even today as well. But it was in the 19th century that there was it's human nature, I think, to be interested in other people in other countries, and yet here you had a group who were different to people who were living in houses, wearing different clothes, having different customs and cultures. And I think, particularly in Blackpool, it was one of the things to do if you were a visitor to the town. You went to the tower, or you went on the beach, or you promenaded down to South Shore. And I know that Gypsy Sarah, who was one of the main fortune tellers, well known in Blackpool history, she used to say that you haven't been to Blackpool unless you've had your fortune told. And I think that was true. I think where thousands used to head down that way.
Absolutely. I think we actually have some images of Gypsy Sarah Boswell. I think the Boswells, here's some of the relations now.
Yeah, this is Gypsy Sarah's son at the back. His name was Alma. He was named Alma because he was born just after the Battle of Alma in the Crimean War. And in the middle is his sister Emma and two of her daughters. And they were all fortune tellers on South Shore. Yeah. And Alma was one of the kind of the original people, one of the original founder members of the community at South Shore. And it was said that he'd been born there. I'm not sure if he was, because he was baptized somewhere else, but
right.
Yeah, he was there one of the longest.
And we also have here, we have some images of the encampment. It says there, Gypsy Sarah's only clever daughter-in-law.
Yeah, so there's a lady called Jenny Boswell. She's married to Tobias Boswell, who's the brother of Alma. And I believe that man, that gentleman with the bowler hat standing to her on her left, is Tobias Boswell. So, and you can see she's got these huge advertising hoardings, and all of the fortune tellers at South Shore would have one of these in front of their tents, showing photographs. You can see a photograph there of the king, showing what prestigious clients they had for their skills.
And that still continues today. You know, if you visit any of the booths in Blackpool,
yep.
There's tons of celebrity.
That's right. Yeah,
and they're very proud of that. It's brilliant. If we can scroll through, maybe we can see.
That's another one of Jenny Boswell, and again with Tobias standing by the side. And those children in the front, I think, are probably Tobias had two. He was married to two wives. Jenny was his second wife, and I believe that those children are probably the children of particularly the girls. The baby may be Jenny's, but the girls, I think, may be from his first wife, Ada Lee, who was a gypsy.
Right.
Now I don't know who that tent belonged to. That's a great picture, and you can see how elaborate it is. They've got benches and for people to sit on while they're waiting to be served, so to speak. Yeah.
We're obviously expecting a good number of people.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen so many benches outside one tent. And this tent is said to be the one that Gypsy Sarah lived in. She tended to. It's always said that she tended to want to live slightly apart from the other gypsies, although she was, related to them. That's one of the probably one of the girls that was in that first picture you showed of Alma and Emma.
You mentioned Sarah wanted to live apart, Sharon. Is that because of her sort of prestigious status within the community?
Well, I think there was that. There was a certain kudos. You had to go slightly further down the beach to be able to have your fortune told by Gypsy Sarah. Oh. I mean, she according to books that I've read about Blackpool, always said that she was one of the founder members, and I believe that to be true. I think but there are in those books there is some sort of false information in that she was only born in 1822, and therefore I don't think she is one of the people. She obviously then couldn't have been one of the founder members in the 1830s, which is when it's sometimes said that the community began. But she was certainly on her way to Blackpool in the 1840s, because she got married in Liverpool to her husband Ned, and had their first daughter there, and then were definitely know we're in Blackpool in the 1850s.
And she's certainly one of the characters that a lot of people talk about.
Yes, and you can see that her family, obviously whatever relationship they had to her, they prized and used it in their advertising on their advertising hoardings.
because her name was so well known. And
she was known not just in Blackpool, but you get press coverage about her in national papers. So yes, virtually the whole country knew of her existence.
And she was telling fortunes before the move to South Shore by Uncle Tom's cabin.
I believe that there were definitely gypsies up at North Shore. I'm not. The records I've seen, they're not named, so I can't for definite say that it was Gypsy Sarah. But I know that she was in Lancashire in the 1840s. Yeah.
Right. And this is another really nice picture.
A general view, just showing with the star in at the back there, and I often wonder how they managed to get these vans onto the sands, because all the time I've been doing the research, I've never seen any horses, perhaps naturally because there's nowhere for them to graze, but it must have been a real job getting the vans on and off the sands, and they did that. They used to spend the summer season in Blackpool, and then in the winter they would go south to Liverpool and Birkenhead, and have their overwintering quarters down there.
And I think these are quite stunning images for people who haven't kind of thought about this community before. This is where they were living, this is where they were working, this was their home.
It was their home, yeah.
And it's, I just think they're beautiful, beautiful pictures. I think.
Yeah, this is a great one of the children. I've been told that this is a family of Lees. I don't know that for a fact, but there definitely were Lees living at South Shore.
Mm-hmm. And can you tell people a little bit more about what was life like in Gypsyville, as it was called?
Well, the name Gypsyville really only came once the pleasure beach began to develop. Obviously, the gypsies were living on the dunes at South Shore long before that, but they were tolerated, I think, because I think it was recognised that they were providing, they were a big economic asset to the town, because they were so popular. It was one of the sights of Blackpool to go to South Shore and see the gypsy population there. In the summer, the main breadwinners in a Romany family at South Shore would have been the women, because they were the ones who were telling the fortunes. And I've seen newspaper reports in the 1880s saying that they were earning as much as £10 to £12 a day, at sixpence and a shilling a time. That's an awful lot of hands to read. And this was against the background of the fact that fortune telling was actually illegal. And the way they got round that was to hang up a sign outside their tents to say, buy a basket for a shilling, and advice given free. So they were purportedly selling baskets, but in fact were reading palms as well.
That's brilliant. That's a very Blackpool way of getting around the system. I love that.
Well, yes, except it didn't always manage to keep them away from the long arm of the law. They were often, if you look at the Blackpool newspapers in the late Victorian times, you'll find many cases of them being pulled up in front of the police courts regularly, and being fined several pounds each time, but going on regardless.
Mm. And that shows their resilience as well.
Resilience, yes.
Yeah. And I think people are very interested in this idea of the gift. We've spoken to members of the Romany Gypsy community, and they've told us all about how the gift, which is them referring to their abilities in fortune telling and palmistry, and that predominantly passes through the women of families, not always, but usually. Is that something you found in your research? Did any of your family members have the gift?
Yes, 3 generations of my family. Pamela Lemontini and Lemontini's mother, who had the unusual name of Fambridge, or Feemy as she was generally called. They were fortune tellers on the beach, and I know that because I've come up with found their names in the newspapers. So and I've no doubt if you go back beyond them, through all the generations, the women, that's what the women in my line would have been doing. Unfortunately, the gift hasn't come down to me.
That was my next question. Have you got any?
So I can't predict what's going to happen tonight.
And I think, along with other people who have, British Romany Gypsy and Traveller and Fairground ancestry, you became a founder of a network, a Romany Traveller Family History Society. Can you tell us a bit more about that and the work that it does?
Yeah, sure. After I finished doing my Blackpool study, I was asked to give some talks about it, and I met up with some other people who'd also got Romany Gypsy and Fairground ancestors, and we thought what a great idea it would be. This was in the days pre-internet, and it was difficult to make contact, so you're working in isolation. If we created this society that people could join, and they could share knowledge with each other, and we could publish a quarterly magazine that they could contribute to, and so pass on their research tips and knowledge to other people. And today we also, the Society also publishes books which have the family trees of Gypsy families in them. So you could well find that if you have Gypsy ancestry yourself, or discover you have, we may have already documented your tree for you. And there's lots of information. If you go to our website, you'll find lots of information about free information that you can lists and lists of baptisms and marriages and burials, and lovely, great selection of photographs and that kind of thing. Lists of books that are useful to you, guides as to how to start to do your family tree.
Fantastic. And sadly, the Romany Gypsy community has, like many minority groups, has faced oppression and prejudice. Is that something you found in your own research? What are your thoughts on that? Yeah,
I'm sorry to say that if you go back to when I was talking about them arriving in this country in 1500s, the legislation, anti-Gypsy legislation, has really existed ever since that time. So there were quite draconian laws passed in the 1500s, which actually forbade Gypsies from coming into the country, and then banished ones that were already here. And even when you come into the 19th century, you'll find laws being passed which forbid fortune telling, which forbid you from sleeping in the open air, from camping too close to a main road, from allowing your horses to stray. So yes, there's always been very specific anti-Gypsy legislation. And in fact, until 1783, let's say, it was actually a capital crime to be a Gypsy. So you could be arrested and hung just because you were born a Gypsy. So yeah.
And I think it's at that time as well, it's actually one of my favourite stories about Blackpool, is that the corporation decided to really clamp down on all kinds of entertainment on the beach that it deemed inappropriate, which was basically everything. And so in 1897, they set the law, everyone off the beach, and they simply just moved over to the gardens of the houses across on the promenade, and that's how the Golden Mile was created. Yeah. Really, affluent, and they did much, better for it. And so I think that, at that time, everyone was sort of clamping down. They wanted everything to be very upper class and very prestigious, and the fortune telling and things didn't fit into that idea that many corporations had of what they wanted their resorts to be like. But so many holidaymakers loved to get their fortune told, and it was such a big pull for people as well. I think particularly during the wartime, when people kind of wanted to know about the future and everything was very uncertain. I think that was a real draw for people to try and find some answers, I think. And people still go today. I think that hasn't changed, has it? People are always looking for answers and some comfort about what's to come.
Yes, I mean, that's right. It was the growth of the pleasure beach really that eventually wanted to take over the land that the gypsies had always traditionally camped on. And you see old photographs of the pleasure beach with the gypsies actually surrounded by the rides. But eventually they were evicted from South Shore in 1910. But they didn't leave town. They went into houses. You find them in the winter gardens and on the piers. So there was obviously a relaxation in the fortune telling was no longer illegal, but they were still there and still providing that service to tourists and providing them with some entertainment.
And we've had some really good questions in the Q&A already, Sharon. I'm just going to jump straight in because I'm too excited to not. Angela has asked, at what age were people allowed to start telling fortunes?
I don't actually know. Certainly you see, or perhaps there never was a rule, I don't know. Most of the people you see queuing up to have their fortunes told in the old photographs tend to be young women, so say perhaps 16, and older women. And it tended to be something that women would do rather than men.
From a contemporary standpoint, just from my conversations with the gypsy community now, I know that they have children in the family that are showing signs of having the gift, but this is a job, and so like any job, you'd have to be 16 to start that work. However, it's coming out, it's becoming apparent from what they were telling me. So I think like any job, they start at 16, but the actual gift becomes apparent much earlier.
And I think they're learning from observing their elders, see how they approach people, and
absolutely. Jill has asked, is there any evidence of the Boswell family in circus history? Do you know, Sharon?
Well, there was a circus family called Boswell, but I don't believe that there was a connection between the Blackpool Boswells and that circus. I mean, Boswell is a Scottish name, and I believe that the Boswell circus was Scottish. So I would say no, but I could happily look into that.
Richard has asked, with the pleasure beach being built next to the South Shore camp, are there any records of Romany gypsies working on the construction of the pleasure beach? He assumes that some did, but he wonders about how many did and how they were treated.
Well, I haven't ever seen any records of them actually building the rides, but I mean, if they were there, I'm sure that they could well have been invited to do so. I have come across records of them actually owning rides themselves. There's one, the Boswell family was said to have a ride called the aerial flight, which was a bit like a zip wire kind of ride. And I know that they also were helping to manage rides as well. But building not. I mean, there may be records in the archives of the pleasure beach itself that may reveal that, which would be fascinating.
Absolutely, and I think a common misconception that people have is that the gypsy community at Gypsyville actually started the pleasure beach, which actually wasn't the case. They were moved from that area so that the pleasure beach could start being built. But I think it's good to know that information as well.
I mean, I think Mr. Bean, who started the Pleasure Beach, I'm sure he was, perhaps he was in one, he probably wanted the land, but I think he was grateful because of the huge footfall that the gypsy camp was bringing down to South Shore, which was obviously helping him as he began to develop the rides down there in the early 20th century.
Absolutely. Stephanie has asked, do you know if there are current generations related to Gypsy Sarah around now, and are they still in Blackpool?
I'm not sure about still in Blackpool, but I am in touch with a lady in Australia who is a descendant of the Emma Boswell that I showed you, that you showed in the picture with Alma. Alma himself didn't have any kids. And I know there are people in Canada as well who are descendants of Gypsy Sarah's eldest daughter, a lady called Dorelia, and she emigrated to Canada at the end of the 19th century with her daughter and some grandchildren. So there are definitely people still around today who have their roots in Blackpool and with Gypsy Sarah. Yeah.
I think sometimes their family tree can be quite complex as well. When we were doing our research, we were trying to get our head around the different branches, and it is quite complicated. But Robert Leach in the chat has said that he's actually spoken to a few of Sarah's ancestors, so they are still around in Blackpool.
Okay, great.
Great to know. Flo has said, are there any links to your family within the fortune tellers that remain in Blackpool now, Sharon? Do you know?
Not that I know of, unfortunately. No, I mean, it was my grandfather was born in Blackpool, but he, after the First World War, he went down to Kent, to Dreamland, and I think he may have been introduced to the fairground down there because that his mother and his father had connections with the Pleasure Beach. So I have no relatives left that I know of in Blackpool, and I only are able to go there as a visitor.
Emma has asked, have you found any information on how much it cost to have your fortune told in Blackpool in the 1800s or the early 1900s? Was it affordable for all, or was it?
Well, yes. I mean, I believe that the average kind of fee was a sixpence or a shilling. Although I think perhaps the gypsies, that was the kind of the initial payment. And if you wanted to know more, they sometimes would ask for another shilling or 2 shillings or half a crown. So yes, but I think it was affordable. So every level of society could afford to have their fortune told, yes.
And correct me if I'm wrong, Sharon, it seemed to be sort of, they were trying to get the more affluent, sort of glamorous visitors at the beginning, and then they really capitalized on the Wakes Weeks visitors. So they were going after whoever was coming to Blackpool, really, but it seemed to have that shift in who was coming to get their fortunes told. Just like the types of visitors changed. You had people coming to promenades from the more affluent classes, and then that changed to people from the factories and the mills of Lancashire, and then they flocked to Blackpool and they were having their fortunes told. So it's kind of a universal experience really throughout the years, which is great really to see. Are the Petrolengro family related to Sarah Boswell? Asks Christine.
Petrolengro, I mean, Petrolengro is the Romany word for smith, and they wouldn't be descendants of Sarah because she was a Boswell, obviously, but there were a lot of smiths, including my own people, relatives, cousins and aunts and uncles of my own ancestors who were in Blackpool. So who, I could well be related to some of those Petrolengros.
And Stephanie says that she is in Norfolk and she wonders which part of Norfolk Sharon's family lived.
Well, they travelled all over the eastern counties. You can find them in Norwich, but they travelled down through Suffolk as well. You find them in the Woodbridge area, and even down into Essex, and even as far as sort of North London. They were following a kind of a circuit every year. They would go following the same route, so they would be attending horse fairs and markets and pleasure fairs as well. So yeah, all over that part of the country, the eastern side.
Cool. And Sue has asked, I'm interested by the point Sharon and Rebecca made about regular prosecutions. Is there any evidence that their particular families were targeted? My previous boss had a theory that prosecutions in Lancaster were more likely to happen with outsiders.
I think I'm not sure how to answer that one.
A complex one, isn't it?
Yes.
I guess, did you find any evidence that particular families were less sort of treated, not as well as others, or was it,
I think it was fairly universal. Yes, it didn't matter who you were or what your surname was. Yes, they were all sort of treated as a whole. I think. So you'll find people from all the families being almost like herded like a group into the court to be tried for fortune telling. And even in the 1880s, I've seen instances of them, because they had been in the court a number of times. They were actually given a prison sentence, and they may well have ended up in Lancaster jail.
Peter has said that his wife is from the fairground community. Please, could you remind him of the resources that you identified previously?
The Romany Traveller Family History Society, does he mean?
I think that's what he means, yeah.
Yes, yeah. So, quite a lot of, you'll find quite a lot of Romany Gypsies actually moving into the fairground world and travelling with rides. And our society has members who are Romany Gypsies who've moved into fairground, and fairground families as well. So if you want to have a look for our website, it's rtfhs.org.uk, and you'll find lots of information there about useful sources for fairground and for Romany Gypsy family history.
And if you could sum up the importance of the Gypsy community in Blackpool, Sharon, what would you say?
Well, I would say that they really would, perhaps it's too dramatic, without the Gypsies, I don't think Blackpool would have ever been the same place. I think they brought a huge amount of entertainment, interest, helped to build the economy of the town, and yes, it wouldn't be the same without them.
Absolutely, I totally agree with that. Stephanie has asked, was there any explanation or reason why they did not have horses, or why they were not seen on the beach? I think you did address this before, Sharon, but I think Stephanie may have missed it.
I'm sorry, could you give me that one again?
Sorry. Stephanie has asked, was there any explanation or reason why they did not have horses, or why they weren't seen on the beach?
On the beach, I think it was. I think they were around. They weren't actually on the beach, but I think down at South Shore, there were obviously green fields beyond the sand dunes in the 19th century, and I think that's where their horses were stabled there, and they were only brought to the beach when they were moving on. But if anybody ever does see a picture of a horse on the beach, I'd be pleased to hear about it.
That's a project for everyone there.
Yes.
And I'm very interested in if you've got any hints or tips for people who may want to research their own heritage. they might want to make as good a discovery as you did. What advice would you give them?
Well, I would say that that there's no need to be concerned if you discover that you've got travelling ancestors and think you're never going to be able to find out anything about them, because as I proved, you can. All of the sources that you use for searching non-gypsies will work for you for looking for Romany ancestors as well. I would obviously, I'm going to say, why not join the Romany and Travel and Family History Society, because we're a friendly bunch of people who will give you lots of advice and lots of help with researching your tree. And you'll find lots of useful information on our website that will point you in the right direction. And as a result of doing my Blackpool study, I was also invited by the Society of Genealogists to write a guide to how to research your family tree. So there's a good place to start if you want to quickly show it to everybody, which is called My Ancestors Were Gypsies. And it was actually written under my former name, which was Sharon Floate. But that's available from the Society of Genealogists and from, I no doubt you're going to find it on online book retailers as well. So.
Fantastic. I'll just leave it for a few more minutes if anyone else has any more questions. But is there anything else that you'd like to cover, Sharon, about your research, or some interesting facts that you discovered about the Romany Gypsy community in Blackpool?
I think we've just about covered everything that I was hoping to be able to talk about today. So, well, perhaps the only other thing to say is that a copy of the Blackpool study that I did is, you'll find it in the local studies section of Blackpool Central Library. There's also a copy of it in the Pleasure Beach Archives and also at the Record Office at Preston. So if anybody wants to go and have a look at that, but remembering that it was written 30 years ago, and my next project will be to bring it up to date with some more research.
And Robert has put in the chat that his contact that he spoke to was called David Boswell. So that's another one to follow up. We've got a lot of homework from this conversation and a lot of research ideas to do as well. So if there's no more questions, I'd like to thank you, Sharon, very, very much. I've found this absolutely fascinating. I think this is such an important area of history. It's an area of history that I think hasn't had, enough attention over the years, and it really should be showcased and emphasised. So, wonderful about the society that you run as well. It's doing great work, and we're thrilled that you've talked to us this evening. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak to you about it, because you can see it's one of my passions.